Hey, this is me from the end of the recording. Just wanted to clarify, I was thinking about deleting my channel. I am not doing that, or at least if I do it, it is not in the imminent future. However, I am totally reconsidering how I spend my time, and while I am not necessarily done with making anime videos, I am definitely taking a step backwards from it to work on other things. The things I'm working on will take a long time to be done. I'm attempting to start doing a semi-frequent podcast just to make things that are not the big project I'm working on, and also because I want an excuse to occasionally talk to people. So if you're someone that likes this channel, don't get that nervous, but you can get a little nervous. Here is my thing. I've had a lot on my mind lately. As most of you know, about a year ago, I got fired in the initial wave of COVID layoffs, and after that happened, I determined I was going to use that free time to pursue YouTube as a full-time endeavor. At the time, I had made literally $0 from YouTube, and the money did not justify it in any way. But I told myself I'm going to use this period of free time to build my channel up as fast as I possibly can. I was hoping that by the time things returned to normal, I would have built the channel up to a point where I'd be making enough money and had enough reputation that I would have a little bit of wiggle room in how I spent my time once I had to get a new job, and I would be able to keep doing this, improving, and build it up further. In that sense, the time spent has been a miserable failure. I have made about $60 in the entirety of my YouTube career, and most of that was in the very brief window of time where I did have a patron, which, looking back on now, I do feel a bit skeevy about because I really disappointed that person, but hopefully they know I did really appreciate that. And despite all the content I've made, I'm only a bit north of 1,000 subs, barely got monetized a few months ago. I am not a successful channel. And the amount of money I get from YouTube is so small that really it's not going to make a difference. That said, my time on YouTube has been very valuable in other ways. I've gained experience, I've made friends, I've made connections, I've met some of the people that I admired when I got into this. As far as I'm concerned, the person who got me into Anitube was Digibro. Well, I got to meet Digi a few months ago. Around the time I set out on this, I was really into Don Jolly. I really admired him and saw him as a role model, and I got to meet a few people from Encyclopedia.zone. I finally have people that I can talk to about the struggle of trying to do something creative, of trying to do something intellectual, of feeling like you need to make something but you're bashing your head against a concrete wall. And no matter what else happens with this, those connections I've gotten to make are valuable to me, more valuable than really any other part of this. And simply in terms of knowing how to assemble and push out a product, I have gained a basic competence in that, even if, as you can now tell, I am still not that great at it. I feel like wherever I go from this point onwards, the events of these last several months, really a year at this point, are valuable in that way, and whatever is coming, I am better prepared for having been through this. That said, the way things have changed in recent months are leaving me feeling very burned, very cynical, and very frustrated. I fucking hate YouTube. YouTube is a horrible environment, it's a horrible model, and while there are certain things it does better than basically any place else, being here for an extended period of time will drive you fucking insane if you don't go into it with the right attitude. The thing about YouTube that makes it so enticing but so dangerous is that it magnifies your exposure in a way that doesn't even make sense. It has been so surreal to develop relationships with other creative people who are not on YouTube in any meaningful way, whose work I admire so much more than my own. Yet when we compare each other's trajectory, I have orders of magnitude more exposure than they do. It is simply in the nature of YouTube that your exposure is supercharged and gets way out of proportion to the value of the work you generate. And in ways, that's good. Who doesn't love exposure? When you're starting out, you want exposure. That's what you're out for. But the problem is, so little of that exposure matters. For most YouTubers, the overwhelming bulk of what you get in terms of views, it's just liquid sliding through your fingers. There's so little you can grab on. My personal rule of thumb throughout this has been something like 1 in 10 of the people who watch your video seriously engage with it, and about 10% of those are into your video enough that if you ask them a favor, if you try to steer them towards something else, there's a decent chance they will do it because they're invested in you enough that they will try to play ball. And for the world, for reality, that's not that bad. But I increasingly compare it to other art forms, especially more traditional ones, and find myself thinking that's so ridiculous. What percentage of people who read the entire first book in a trilogy go on to read book 2? It is probably higher than 1%. And part of why that is the people who read the whole first book probably paid for the whole first book. There's an investment there. They made a conscious decision to engage with the content. They weren't standing in front of a giant airport baggage train of books, picking up and flipping through random ones before they eventually got hooked enough to stay. That trilogy of books found people partially through advertising, but to a large extent through word of mouth and reputation of the author. Something real, where the fans latched onto the person who did it and developed a serious ongoing knowledge of who they were. And out of people who read the trilogy of books, what percentage do you think will go to the author's next series if they get all the way through it? Probably a lot more than 10%. The exposure is smaller, but it's solid. It's real. You can depend on it. The amount of people reading the book is an accurate reflection of the value of the book because there's investment there. If someone tried to propose a model for reading books that turned them into background noise that was randomly thrown up while you were doing other things, authors would rightfully be insulted and everyone involved would question the model of what was being done. There's an inbuilt mechanism to that industry that makes sure that value, investment, and exposure don't get too far away from each other. And there's also a beautiful efficiency there, where there is a match between the effort that goes into making something and the joy and value and investment that is produced when the other person consumes it. It's a conversation. Both the speaker and the listener are somewhat aware of what the other person is doing and locked in on each other. And you cannot hope to say this about YouTube. I have recently become aware of and fixated on the incredible amount of waste and noise that goes on in this system. For one, the amount of content that is produced relative to the amount of content that is needed is absurd. It's a waste. It shouldn't exist. A really extreme example of this is something like reaction channels. Every time someone gets in the reaction channels, I look at it and I feel so confused because it seems fundamentally doomed. You are pretending to watch a show and having emotional reactions to it. There only needs to be 2 or 3 people doing that, if even that. Just pick the 2 or 3 people who have the most emotive faces and have them watch every show and then you're done. And the thing is, the distribution of success with these people is just as brutal as any other aspect of YouTube. The top few people get almost all the views, then it swoops down and there's this long, narrow tail where you have hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people doing these videos and getting a tiny, tiny proportion of the entire market. But the thing is, YouTube is so bloated and so huge that even though the amount of value they contribute to the overall system in proportion is so small, they still get thousands of views, which is enough to keep them going and doing it again when any rational person would look at this and go, there is a better way to spend your life. And here's the thing about the long tail. It exists in a lot of places and it's not always bad. I might be wrong about this. I believe the long tail, the phrase being used in this context, originated with Amazon. And one thing they noticed is there were a few titles that overwhelmingly outsold everyone else, where a huge portion of the books sold were in a very narrow band of things that were very popular and that lots of people wanted. But if you dug into the smaller creators that still made some money but weren't crazy successful, you found a lot of diversity. You found a lot of niche interests. You found people filling needs that were small but valuable to both sides. But YouTube creates this distortion where in many places, when you go into the long tail, when you go into the not super popular channels, when you go into the channels that are still there but not that popular, many of them are doing diverse little niche stuff. But unlike most creative places, you also find a big glut of people doing the same thing, people doing slightly better or worse versions of the same content, and they still hang around. When I believe in a more functional market that was less insane and distorted by Alphabet's fucking nonsense, they would be punished out of existence by total non-exposure. And when I say that with that tone of voice, the obvious implication is that I somehow don't believe that I'm a part of that. I think I am above the problem. I think I'm outside the problem. but I find it becoming harder and harder to make excuses for what I do and why it is not contributing to this. When I started doing this, or more specifically, when I found my footing, had more sense of what I wanted my videos to be, what I told myself is, I am going to be the most insightful person on AniTube. I would never be the biggest, I'd never be the most charismatic, and I would definitely never be the funniest or the most charming, but I had a thought, I am intuitive, I am penetrating, I have an analytical mind, I can dive into a show, find a really neat little observation about it, build it into something larger, and I can write tight, thesis-driven scripts which really no one else can. I did feel like there was a hole in the AniTube community that I had a decent chance of being able to fill. As far as I could tell, really nobody on AniTube resembled me all that much. On a superficial level, my format was similar to people like Digi, but my approach to the material I analyzed did seem fairly unique. Probably the most similar person to me was Explanation Point, whose tastes were significantly different, style was very different, and far better, I will admit. But out of everyone, he was the only person who seemed similar enough to me that was even going to be an issue. And my tastes and sensibilities were far enough removed from his that I thought, this probably won't be a problem. But at this point, the experiment has been ran, and I don't think there's really a market out there for what I do. And I will admit, part of that is quality. My videos are very rough in a lot of places. My speaking isn't great, my charisma's not great, my production is very conventional. I rid entirely on the quality of my scripts, and I'm finally accepting that's just not enough. It doesn't matter. And in a weird fucking way, that not mattering is why I thought I had a chance. A few years ago, when Digi attacked everyone in that rant complaining about Gigax writing and how loose and sloppy everyone is, I was very much on their side. To me, that was music to my ears. And the fact that quality writing was so absent from AniTube really made me think, if I go in there and I'm a good writer, that might get me somewhere. I thought there was a real chance that I could become the best writer on AniTube because, frankly, it wouldn't be that fucking hard. And while the people who like my videos do consistently praise the quality of my writing, it doesn't matter. And why would I think otherwise? It was a sort of reverse survivorship bias, where I looked at the poor quality of the writing and went, they need a good quality writer. When I should have been considering the opposite conclusion and going, look at the poor quality of the writing. That probably means that good writers don't fucking survive in that environment, or they have better things to do elsewhere. I feel bad even saying this because it doesn't make sense to bitch and moan. You're not entitled to a creative environment that is suitable to you. But on the flip side of that, it is rational to ask if you are using your time in a good way, and I increasingly find myself thinking that there's just nothing here. When I went into AniTube, I did so with full knowledge that there was only enough money in this place that 4 or 5 people could do it seriously. And it was never even my ambition to get there. The whole time my end goal was to get to a point where I could simply free up blocks of time out of my month to make sure I had time to work on creative stuff. And I've come to realize that was a completely nonsensical way of looking at it. A few months ago when they were passing through my area, I drove out and I met with Digi and the crew, Riley, Bird, Mint, and the whole experience made me realize how small the world is. Or more specifically, how small this world is. It made me realize how much has changed since this started. Somewhere in the flurry of trying to do this for real, trying to be a serious YouTube guy, I forgot that this was never my dream. At no point in my life did I ever look at YouTube as this exalted, beautiful thing, except by contrast. When I look back at the artists and creatives that I really loved, they were stand-up comedians, they were radio personalities, they were writers. They were not YouTube anime analysts. In my early 20s, I admired Jim Norton more than basically anyone on the planet. He was so cool. I loved Jim. And as much as I admire some of the people I look up to on YouTube, it's not the same thing. When I got onto YouTube, I was in such a psychologically bad place that it was difficult for me to leave my house. Things were really fucking bad for a while there. I don't even know how many years ago this was. 3, 4, I think 2017. I had a living situation collapse on me horribly, And I entered a period of my life where a few times a week I would leave to take a shift at an old security job I had, but I spent almost all of my time holed up in my empty apartment, living by myself, really doing nothing. And during that time, I got really, really into anime. I basically got to the point where the only emotion I could feel other than a sense of impending doom was watching anime. It was my only escape from how miserable I was on a minute-by-minute basis. And because I had so much time by myself, lounging around my dark apartment as my brain dissolved, I tried to fill more time and I got into AniTube. And the funny thing is, Digi was never my favorite, at least at the beginning. My favorite guy was Unique Namesaurus, who I thought was hilarious, and unfortunately he's inactive at this point, but I like his stuff quite a bit. Really liked Explanation Point, thought he had really good opinions. Obviously, I love Super Eyepatch Wolf because he's just a virtuoso of video production who, even if he's not the best at anything, he is second best at everything else. But what made Digi so interesting to me was when I looked at their content and as I got into Digibro After Dark and I understood their narrative more, I had this really compelling vision of someone who was completely fucked. In Digi, I found a really compelling narrative and example of how someone could be a total loser, a washout with nothing going for them, and through a combination of guts and creativity, could fight their way into something better. Where the idea of doing something creative had appealed to me for a long time in a way that I wasn't really conscious of. This was the part in my life where it really clicked. Oh, I have to do something creative. That's how my mind works. I don't care about anything enough to stick with it unless it's something creative. But even though I had tried to write a book in high school and I'd done things here and there, I'd never stuck with anything long enough to make real progress. And through the combination of YouTube and seeing Digi, it made me feel like I can actually do this. It's not just that YouTube is creative work. It's creative work that someone who is completely fucked and has no resources can do on their own. And perhaps more important, it's not a multi-year commitment. You can make something in a month or two and then push it out. At a time when I did not have the emotional strength to do anything that would expose me socially or put me at the mercy of other people, through Digi, I found a little corner of the world where I might be able to try. And I'm realizing now, I'm not the same person anymore. So really, why am I here? At the time I got into YouTube, I hated myself so completely that I had basically accepted that I was going to commit suicide. It was a time in my life when I couldn't look at myself or think about the fact that I existed without feeling visceral disgust, self-hatred, and a sense of complete knowledge this needs to end. And when I started watching Digibro After Dark, something that hooked me so powerfully was the way Digi presented themselves. It was almost as if they could not process the idea that what they were doing was not legitimate. I felt like a horrible person, and because I am someone who is very prone to guilt, very prone to self-criticism, being in that state destroyed me. It left me paralyzed. I couldn't move because I felt like I wasn't supposed to exist. And when I looked at Digi, I saw someone where almost any rational human being would question their existence on some level, and their response was this iron commitment of, no, I am right, I'm supposed to be here, I will struggle forward and survive in this world no matter what. It was never Digi's writing or skill or work ethic that really got me. It was their tenacity. It was their ability to legitimately be kind of disgusting and horrible, and still look out at the world with total faith that they were supposed to be a part of it. That was something that I wanted and needed more than anything in the world, and it made YouTube feel like something that could work for me. Where if I get out there and I start slugging it out and I make my own content and I build my own life, I can eventually turn this into something that will help me get through this. And all at once I'm realizing that one, I'm past that. I'm not struggling to have a basic compatibility with the reality around me anymore. I'm not doing great, but I'm more or less okay. And on the other hand, there's really not a lot of opportunity here, so why am I doing this? I'm not a guru by any means, but when I got out of college, I studied investment for a little bit. I found it very interesting. I learned a few things. And the more I look at the YouTube environment, the more I see it as a trap. When you're dealing with probability, investing, gambling, things like that, There's a concept called a balanced game. In gambling, it's often called equal conditions, where it's basically this. Imagine that you have a game where you win 10% of the time, but when you win, you get 10 times the payout. If you repeated that over and over and over again, the amount of money you have would basically never change. Then you have another game. You win 1 in 1,000 times, but when you do win, it pays out 1,000 times over. Same thing. And the thing is, if you have enough instances of those repeating over and over again, you could do one or the other, and it wouldn't really make a difference. The amount of change in your money you would expect would be the same. And when you look at all the different activities that humans do, you tend to find patterns like this, where some activities are high risk, high return, some activities are low risk, low return, and you would expect that more or less they balance out. Where if you set out to be a construction worker, you have a very good chance of getting that job, but your payout won't be that good. But if you go after something like becoming a movie star or starting a business, very few of those succeed, but the ones that do get a huge payout. And because humans have a fair degree of freedom in what they pursue, these will generally stay more or less in equilibrium with each other. Because if the environment changes and you have a game where 1 out of 2 people succeed, but the people who do succeed win something like 20 times the return, people are going to see that and start flocking to it. But the number of successes will not change, and the rate of failure will increase until everything's in proportion. And it's the same thing with an activity getting too risky. If 1 in 100 people succeed at a task, but it only pays out 10 times over, people are going to eventually go, fuck that, leave, and the failure rate will change until it makes sense. That is a caricature, that is a crazy oversimplification, but that's the basic idea of how it works. And the thing is, if anything, these will get out of whack in the direction of high-risk activities paying more than they should have to, because of a bias called loss aversion. If you go to a random human on the street and you offer them a game, you said, I'm going to flip a coin. If you guess wrong, you lose $100. If you guess right, you get a certain amount of money. What does that amount of money need to be before you will take the bet? With most people, the amount of money they have to get has to be much higher than what they would lose for them to take the game. They'll say something like 150, 200, maybe even 300 or more dollars. To almost every human, losing something is a much bigger deal than gaining that same amount. And this is part of why artists and creative people have so much money. Almost all humans, if you give them a choice between a job where they reliably get $100,000 a year and another job where there's a 1% chance of success, but if they succeed, they'll get $10 million a year, almost everyone is going to go towards the safe job. And that causes the reward for the risky job to get even bigger than it theoretically should be. I have come to believe that YouTube's fucking behavior is distorting the creative market in a way where the risk is still there, but the reward really isn't. Where with something like being filmmakers or writing novels or painting a famous work of art, hardly anyone is going to succeed, but the people who do are going to make a fuckload of money. I feel that YouTube has found a way to turn the heat down to a low simmer and cause a large number of people to feel the emotions as if they are in a high-risk, high-return creative field, but the reward really isn't there. And you see this with the constant stress that YouTubers have to make frequent content to not lose their audience, where they will make videos that don't even really feel like significant progress due to the hyper-competitive environment and due to the nuances of the algorithm. That is not a high-risk, high-return situation. That is an instance of people weighing losses as being more important than the gains on the other side, where they could be making content that they care about and that they see as organic growth, but they are expending that energy towards something they don't really see as legitimate progress, but which prevents them from losing their position. If you think of this in terms of risk and return and human behavior and cognitive bias, that doesn't follow the creative model, that follows the conventional career model. That incentive structure much more closely mimics an office job or a labor job than a truly creative job. And people are primarily focused on not losing their position rather than chasing the possibility of something really incredible happening, which is what creatives do. I think YouTube has created an incentive structure where, because you can get a small audience easily, which you are then afraid to lose, It plays into a cognitive framework which is fundamentally low risk, low return oriented, but has the veneer of creativity and feels like something adventurous and high risk, even though it really isn't. And now that I feel I'm understanding the mechanics of what's happening, it's hard not to feel like this whole thing is fucking stupid. I think it's important to remind ourselves, YouTube is not real. It is a Frankenstein monster created by Alphabet where they're playing games with meta information and distant political maneuvering. It's almost as if the YouTube audience is a fucking tumor that is created by forces that have nothing to do with the actual consumption patterns. If there had to be a real connection and serious engagement between the consumers on YouTube and the people who produce the content, think of how little of it would actually get made. Another way to say that is imagine if people had to actually pay for videos. It would be so much harder to get on the platform, but such a small amount of what gets made would actually be there, and the quality of what got made would be so much higher. YouTube has created a situation where they have to capture almost none of the value that is generated here to keep the site going. And because of that, there's nothing controlling or moderating the amount of value being generated. No one cares that it's not even part of the structure. You cannot let yourself look at YouTube and believe this is conventional artistic production. This is a lot of noise in the shape of artistic production that is allowed to continue because the mechanisms that would normally stamp out waste in a system are not here. I always took YouTube as seriously as I could manage. I really tried to respect what I was doing. I really tried to respect other content creators. In the back of my head, though, there was always this little note of, at some point, I will have to try to do something else. A few months ago, I had this realization. It was mostly triggered by me meeting Digi, but it was always there, where it suddenly clicked that I do not have to achieve legitimacy as a YouTuber before I do something else. And in mid-December, I started writing a book. It changed very rapidly in scope and what I expected from it, and I now view it as the main thing I'm working on. My book is not a novel, but it is my first attempt at long-form writing since I was a teenager, so I looked up some writing tips and I got really into the lectures of Brandon Sanderson. He is a beloved fantasy author. Several of my friends like him. Thupa sent me an audiobook actually a few weeks ago. But he teaches a course at BYU, and the stories he tells made me question things so much. He talks about how he has been in the same writing circle for over 10 years. And there are people in that writing circle of all success levels. Sanderson is a multimillionaire, he has a few kind of pro people in there, a few semi-pros, and he has people who, even though their writing is fantastic, have never sold a book. But even though their success levels are so different, everyone goes to this writing circle, they try their hardest to do their best, and they just truck onwards. And there was something so beautiful about that, where 100% of their effort goes into writing good books or getting better at writing good books. There is no waste. Everything they do, they get to take with them. There are some marketing concerns, they're not that big. And the simple act of fitting into a genre, which for Sanderson is fantasy, mostly takes care of marketing for them. There's no fucking algorithm, there's no gaming the system, there's no writing short stories every 3.5 weeks to keep everyone satisfied while they work on the real thing. They zero in on, this is a good story, this is the best I can do, I'm going to spend years crafting the best piece I can, and either I make it or I don't. And Sanderson says, even among the ones who succeeded, it was completely normal to write 5, 6, 7 books before they broke through. And several people in this circle have little stacks on their shelves of novels they have wrote for themselves that hardly anyone has read, but they tried their hardest, they got better as a writer, and it eventually got them to the point where they were good. And there's such a beautiful efficiency there. Everybody knows there are more aspiring writers on this planet than we would ever need. Everybody knows not everyone's going to make it. But out of all the fiction writers who take it seriously, they put their nose to the grindstone, do the best they can, whoever makes it, and the art that goes out to the world was the absolute best those people could do. It's almost like an army riding out the battle. Even if they win, half the people are going to die, but everyone knows unless they all go out together, it's not going to happen for anyone. And now that I'm understanding the big picture, that's what you're supposed to fucking do. If you see yourself as a creative person, you're not supposed to be fucking around, you're not supposed to be gaming the system, you're not supposed to be placating your fucking audience. Either your work is good enough or it's not. Or if you're not good enough, maybe you should be sitting with your nose at the grindstone, improving until you can make something great. And I'm not saying that small artists should not exist, that they should not get exposure, but everyone should be doing the best that they can do, and then letting the world sort out whether or not it gives a fuck. They shouldn't be gaming the system. Although I do think there is one exception. This is going to sound like a tangent, but the Alvin and the Chipmunk movies. The bad guy in those movies is a comedian named David Cross. I don't necessarily love him as a person, but he has done some fantastic work. He was doing an interview where he was talking about people mocking him for doing the Alvin and the Chipmunks movies, and his response was, "Yeah, I know those movies are stupid, but taking a few months to be the bad guy in those movies, it gave me millions of dollars, I funded independent theater, I gave opportunities to a lot of really deserving friends that I really believed in what they did." He did stupid bullshit, but it wasn't to prop up his image of himself as an artist. It was to get resources that would allow for good art to happen. And I think that makes sense. I think you can do hack, stupid filler work if doing so creates a net gain for the amount of good art that you can do. That's fine. But if that's not happening, if the filler stuff is becoming the point or the focus of what you do, or even more than that, if you could free up more time for yourself by working a conventional job, as opposed to spending that time doing bullshit kind of creative work that's really just filler, then you should just work a normal job. I'm going to have to do that before too long. I don't think it's that bad anymore. This little adventure I went on where I stole time to LARP as a full-time creator, early on I realized it's really hard for me to do anything that I don't really believe in deep down. I was wrong to ever fight my instinct on that. That was the right thing to do. Just focus on the good stuff. And you can do a lower effort thing from time to time, but because you think that it is more valuable than the effort that goes into it. Not content for the sake of content. That's such an insane idea. I'm kind of embarrassed that I even believed in that ever. Looking back over this last year, I'm fucking glad that my attempt to do the YouTube thing crashed and burned so early, because at no point did I stop working on my actual videos that I care about. I just realized I had to accept my limitations with how fast I could work. Because that's what matters. YouTube being this river of eyeballs, where all these mediocre people are trying to plug into it like ticks and suck the eyes out with their proboscis. This was a bad metaphor of the mix. It's just disgusting. It's a waste of human time and effort and talent. And here's the thing, it was probably a bigger waste for me than most people. A fair portion of the YouTube communities I come up against, they seem to realize there's not a lot going on here. Some of them are delusional. Some of them need to be punched in the face. But a fair number of people seem to treat this more as a social club than as a serious artistic endeavor, and you can do that. Making bad art as an excuse to meet friends, there's nothing sinful about that, it's just not what I'm after, I guess. Although I guess I did make friends by making bad art, just not on purpose. But I'm asking myself now, what was the real value here? What can I take with me? Me and Thupa had the idea to do that Mandy podcast a while ago, and we'll probably do another one on Nick Cage. We like Nick Cage. And it looks like somewhere between 10 and 20 people kind of watched a fair chunk of it, and only 5 or 6 people really watched it. If I'm a few years into this and that's where I am, both in terms of my ability to make something like that and its ability to get a response, that doesn't speak too well in terms of building an audience. As far as I can tell, there are several dozen people in my subscribers that do genuinely like my videos, and there's even a few people here who developed a strong personal connection to them. They saw it as something meaningful to them in their lives. And that matters. That's value. That counts. But knowing that 800 or 900 of the people who are subscribed to me have no real investment in me whatsoever, I find that frustrating, because that puts the onus on me to have the discipline to look at my own creative platform and go, oh, that's fake. Green, remind yourself that 90% of the engagement on here really means nothing, and there's about 10% of the people here who will kind of go with you on certain things if you don't stray too far from what you've done. The YouTube creator interface is a hologram hallucination generator created to delude people into feeling more important than they are. On this channel, all that really matters is the people who liked my content enough to care when the next thing came out. I'm sure some other people enjoyed some of the videos I did, but it's something frivolous. No one is taking that with them. And I think this is the thing about YouTube. If you are using YouTube as anything other than a server where you store your videos, you are being conned. And the problem isn't even so much that you are being conned as it entices you to lie to yourself. I think this is what YouTube is good for. Where previously there was this really sharp cliff with artistic achievement, YouTube has extended this membrane from the bottom of that edge of success all the way down to the zero, where you can get eyes on what you do and you can keep working and you can have a audience and a little environment to develop yourself in, but you have to look at it as something artificial and almost like a set of training wheels. I think that YouTube will have a lasting positive impact on the world in that it has created an apparatus and an infrastructure that lets creatives get from 0 to 1. It lets people start with nothing and get a little bit of progress that they can use on something else. I have greatly improved my discipline. I have improved my writing. I have even improved my voice work, which I absolutely despise. And more than anything else, I have met and started to develop relationships with other human beings who know what the fuck they're doing and add value to my life. A few years ago, I had none of that. Really, a year ago, I had none of that. But it would be a mistake to try to repeat that over and over and over again. It's kind of like being an indentured servant. Where back in the colonial days, if a white person from Europe wanted to move to America but had no money, they could work for someone for free for a set number of years, after which they'd be on their own and they'd have a small amount of saved resources they could use to build themselves up. If they had had the money to move there themselves, it would have been insane to do that. The whole concept was they had nothing, and even if they didn't improve all that much, their end situation was better than nothing. If an indentured servant came over, worked their 5 years, looked at the progress they had made and said, "Sweet, I'm going to sign up for another 5 years," that would be insane. Because the whole idea is now they're in a situation where they can do it properly where before they could not. And I think I've settled on that as being the big lesson for YouTube. The rewards you get here are not solid. They're very flimsy. Most of what you get will be intangible, spiritual gains that you can parlay into something more valuable later on. In terms of opportunity, YouTube is a mile wide and an inch deep. If you're doing something radically new, you can build something here. But the rewards you get for it will almost always be way smaller than if you had done it somewhere else. And while this place can do incredible things for someone who truly has nothing, once you make progress, understand the goal is to leave. You can be a legitimate, creative person who uses YouTube. That is not true if YouTube is using you.